Carl Jung once wrote that the most dangerous person in a society is not the criminal, but the individual who no longer needs it. If you are watching this and you have always felt slightly outside the circle, never fully inside the laughter, never fully convinced by the rituals, never quite comfortable performing the version of yourself that others seem to accept, you may have been told something is wrong with you. Too distant, too quiet, too intense, too independent. But Jung discovered something that overturns this accusation entirely. He found that some people who walk alone are not socially defective. They are psychologically sovereign. Society interprets the loner as broken because society cannot understand someone who does not crave its approval. And approval is the currency of control. Remove the need for validation, and the entire architecture of social pressure begins to tremble. What Jung uncovered in his clinical work was unsettling. The individuals who kept no friends, who seemed immune to gossip, trends, collective outrage, and social games, were not suffering from deficits in empathy or intelligence. In many cases, they possessed heightened awareness, a piercing perception, a kind of psychological X-ray vision. They were not disconnected from humanity. They were observing it. And that difference changes everything. Because once you no longer require inclusion to feel whole, you cannot be threatened with exclusion. And that is where the danger begins. This video is not about loneliness. It is about what happens when a human being develops an inner world so complete that the outer world loses its power to define them. If you are seeing this, it may be because you are already standing at the edge of that transformation. But before we talk about power, we must talk about the invisible prison almost everyone else lives inside, the invisible problem. Jung introduced the concept of the collective unconscious, an invisible psychological inheritance we all share. It contains archetypes, myths, inherited patterns of behavior and expectation. But beyond that, it also functions as a silent regulator of conformity. Most people believe they are thinking independently. They are not. They are thinking within acceptable parameters. From childhood, your nervous system is trained to associate safety with approval. A smile from your parents regulates you. Laughter from peers stabilizes you. Praise in school anchors your sense of worth. Gradually, your body learns something profound and dangerous. Belonging equals survival. This wiring becomes so deep that adults will sacrifice authenticity to preserve inclusion. They will date people who feel wrong but look acceptable. They will stay in careers that drain them because prestige feels safer than uncertainty. They will silence doubts in order to maintain harmony, and they will call this maturity. But Jung saw something different. He saw that what we call normal social functioning is often a collective agreement to avoid self-confrontation. Groups operate on unspoken contracts. We do not mention the father's drinking. We do not question the toxic boss. We do not expose the subtle envy in friendships. We maintain the illusion so the structure remains stable. Every group has its persona. The persona, in Jungian psychology, is the mask you wear to meet social expectations. It is necessary, but dangerous when mistaken for the self. Most people over-identify with their persona. They become the mask. They forget what lies beneath it. But the loner never fully fuses with the mask. And that creates tension. Because when you do not internalize the group's expectations as your identity, you remain slightly outside its spell. That outsideness is often misdiagnosed as antisocial behavior. In reality, it may be psychological noncompliance. The invisible problem is this. Most people are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of meeting themselves without witnesses, and so they stay in noise. The loner, however, does something radical. They enter silence, and silence reveals what noise was hiding. The psychological mechanism. To understand why the loner develops such psychological strength, we must examine several deeper mechanisms Jung described. First, the immunity to projection. Projection is the act of disowning parts of yourself and attributing them to others. The group thrives on projection. It bonds through shared enemies. It stabilizes itself by collectively condemning what it refuses to see internally. The loner, spending extended time alone, gradually loses the ability to sustain these projections. Without constant external targets, your shadow begins to surface. The shadow is not evil. It is everything you were taught was unacceptable. Anger, ambition, envy, sexuality, cruelty, brilliance, hunger for power. When you are alone long enough, these elements knock on your internal door. Most people flee back to distraction at this point. The loner stays, and something extraordinary happens. Instead of collapsing under the weight of self-recognition, they begin integration. Integration is alchemy. It is the transformation of unconscious material into conscious awareness. The anger becomes assertiveness. The envy becomes clarity about desire. The ambition becomes disciplined purpose. But this process is destabilizing. Because as you integrate your shadow, shame loses its grip. And shame is the primary weapon of collective control. Second, the nervous system recalibration. Many people regulate themselves externally. Their emotional stability depends on feedback. Silence feels threatening because it removes the signals that tell them who they are. The loner's nervous system adapts differently. Solitude becomes regulating rather than dysregulating. Stillness becomes grounding instead of frightening. They develop what Jung might describe as a strong axis between ego and self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche. The self, in Jungian theory, is the totality of the psyche, the inner organizing principle guiding individuation. When your ego aligns with the self rather than with public approval, you experience a profound internal coherence. You may have fewer friends, but you have less internal conflict. Third, the observer archetype awakens. Jung spoke of archetypes as universal patterns embedded in the psyche. The loner often activates the archetype of the seer, the one who stands slightly apart in order to perceive patterns others miss. While others participate in social theater, the seer watches the choreography. You begin to notice contradictions. The activist driven by ego, the moralist hiding corruption, the nice friend who subtly competes, the workplace that claims innovation but punishes deviation. These observations are not cynical, they are unfiltered. But here is the cost. Once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. Participation becomes conscious, effortful, sometimes impossible. Fourth, the confrontation with anima and animus. In isolation, you encounter not only your shadow but your inner opposite, the anima or animus, the inner feminine within men, the inner masculine within women. These psychic energies shape how you relate to others. Most people unconsciously project their anima or animus onto partners, expecting others to complete them. The loner, through solitude, withdraws these projections. Instead of seeking wholeness in relationship, you cultivate it internally. This makes relationships optional rather than necessary. And optional relationships are terrifying to those who rely on dependency to maintain control. Finally, individuation begins. Individuation is Jung's term for the process of becoming who you truly are, distinct from collective patterns yet deeply connected to your authentic nature. It is not rebellion, it is differentiation. The loner often begins individuation earlier or more intensely because social immersion does not dilute their confrontation with the unconscious. And individuation changes everything. The turning point. There is a moment. It does not arrive loudly. It is not dramatic. It feels like standing in a dark room and realizing you are not afraid of the dark anymore. Perhaps you are sitting alone one evening. No messages, no invitations, no noise. And instead of anxiety, you feel something unexpected. Relief. The performance is over. You no longer need to calibrate yourself to anyone's expectations. No subtle scanning of faces, no adjustment of tone, no mental rehearsal of what is acceptable. You meet yourself, and what you find is not emptiness, but depth. This is the descent Jung experienced during his confrontation with the unconscious. He voluntarily entered psychological darkness and faced images that shattered his previous identity. Symbolically, this is the alchemical nigredo, the blackening, the death of false identity. You realize that much of who you thought you were was built to survive social approval, and you let it burn. In that fire, something reorganizes. The persona loosens. The shadow integrates. The anima or animus becomes internal guide rather than projected savior. And the self, the quiet center, emerges. This is not arrogance. It is solidity. And once you feel it, you cannot return to unconscious dependence. The danger. Here is why Jung warned others to approach such individuals with caution. A person who no longer fears exclusion cannot be controlled by it. A person who has faced their shadow cannot be blackmailed by exposure. A person who derives identity internally does not panic when reputation fluctuates. This destabilizes systems built on collective pressure. Families may label you cold. Friends may call you distant. Workplaces may interpret your refusal to engage in politics as arrogance. But what truly unsettles them is this. You are not playing. You are observing. And sometimes you speak. When you name the unspoken tension in a room, you rupture the group's denial agreement. When you walk away from prestige because it violates your values, you reveal that their compromise was optional. When you refuse to join collective outrage, you expose how much of it is performance. And performance resents the mirror. The danger is not that you become destructive. The danger is isolation. Psychological sovereignty carries cost. There will be seasons where you question whether the clarity is worth the distance. There will be moments when belonging tempts you to dim your perception. But dimming now feels like self-betrayal. You have tasted coherence, and incoherence is unbearable. The transformation. If you continue this path consciously, without bitterness, without superiority, without contempt, something remarkable happens. Your solitude matures. It stops being defensive. It becomes creative. You begin building rather than merely observing. Art, ideas, structures, philosophies. Because when you are not consumed by maintaining social position, psychic energy becomes available for creation. This is why so many breakthroughs in history emerged from individuals working in isolation. Not because they hated humanity, but because they needed silence to access deeper currents. Psychological sovereignty does not mean you reject connection. It means you choose it freely. When you do enter relationships, they are no longer based on mutual dependency or shared denial. They are based on resonance. You are not seeking completion. You are offering wholeness. And that changes the quality of every interaction. You become calm in chaos, clear in confusion, stable in emotional storms, because your axis is internal. You do not need to dominate. You do not need to impress. You do not need to conform. You simply are. And paradoxically, this grounded presence often attracts deeper, more authentic connection than frantic social striving ever could. But you must guard against one final shadow, superiority. The loner who despises humanity becomes trapped in a different prison. True individuation includes compassion. You see the collective trance, and you understand why it exists. Belonging once protected us. Approval once ensured survival. You are not above the tribe. You have simply stepped slightly outside it, and from that position you can choose how to engage. Conclusion. If you have walked alone for most of your life, perhaps it was not a defect. Perhaps it was preparation. Preparation to meet yourself without distraction. Preparation to integrate your shadow rather than project it. Preparation to withdraw false dependencies and cultivate internal wholeness. The world may interpret your solitude as absence, but Jung would have recognized it as gestation. Something is forming in silence. And when it fully emerges, it will not need applause to exist. It will not collapse under criticism. It will not betray itself for comfort. You are not dangerous because you reject people. You are dangerous because you cannot be psychologically owned. And once you discover that your identity does not depend on witnesses, a strange freedom appears. A quiet, steady, immovable freedom. Society fears this because it cannot manipulate what it cannot shame. But freedom is not cruelty. It is responsibility. Responsibility to live according to your own integrated truth. If you are seeing this and something in you recognizes these words, then perhaps your solitude is not something to cure. Perhaps it is something to refine, because the individual who can stand alone without collapsing can stand anywhere without kneeling. And that is the beginning of real power. 5 clickable Jung-style YouTube titles. Carl Jung. Why the loner is the most dangerous person in society. Jung's warning about people who walk alone. The hidden power of those who keep no friends. Jungian psychology. Why solitude creates psychological sovereignty. Carl Jung. Jung. The loner who escapes collective control. 3 thumbnail text options. Too aware to belong. Dangerously independent. Free from control. SEO optimized description. 250 to 300 words. Why did Carl Jung believe that people who walk alone possess extraordinary psychological power? In this deep Jungian analysis, we explore the hidden strength of the loner, not as someone broken or antisocial, but as someone who has developed psychological sovereignty. Drawing from Jung's concepts of the shadow, persona, projection, anima/animus, and individuation, this video reveals why solitude can become a catalyst for inner transformation. While society often pressures individuals to conform, seek validation, and merge with collective expectations, Jung observed that those who can stand alone may access a deeper layer of consciousness. We examine how shadow integration dissolves shame, how nervous system recalibration reduces dependency on social approval, and why the individuation process makes certain individuals resistant to manipulation. This freedom can appear threatening to systems built on collective agreement, but it also represents a profound evolutionary development of the psyche. If you have ever felt like an outsider, if you have questioned social norms, if you find peace in solitude rather than fear, this exploration of Jungian psychology may change how you understand yourself. Solitude is not loneliness. It may be the beginning of sovereignty.